Good morning. There's no way that I could do Mr. Pratt justice by trying to introduce him and his background. The issue that he's going to speak about today is an issue that has been a topic of discussion with this group since I've been involved for the last 14 years. Our federal partners are in the room, and they're always in the room with us, and thank you for being here this morning. He's going to provide us information. He's going to provide us some history. I think you'll find it entertaining, but I think you'll find it extremely informative.
I know in this audience we have people with different viewpoints. I'm glad you're here. We all pledged to uphold the Constitution, and the encroachments upon it happened before we were born. These occupations are good and honorable, but how do we restore liberty in the land? How do we restore peace and sanity to good government? Work together. BLM, Forest Service, any government agency that's represented in here, sheriffs, work together. So what shall we do? I don't know. I can't tell you what to do. I just know that I have spent 5 months trying to understand jurisdiction, and I finally got my mind around it. Were today's public lands purchased by the consent of the legislature of the states? When I was a boy, the United States Forest Service was our best friend. Now the Forest Service and BLM are our worst enemies. Sheriff Palmer asked the similar question. He said, where does the Forest Service get its constitutional authority to have law enforcement officers within Grant County? Clarence Thomas, there are really only two ways to interpret the Constitution. Try to discern as best we can what the framers intended, or just make it up. The sovereign states and subdivisions are duty-bound. They're going to draw a line, and in 1798, they called this interposition, to interpose. Hopefully you won't be offended by anything I said. Bound by oath to uphold and defend this Constitution and the Constitution of the state that you live in, that you're working in. And maybe we'll all come together, the sheriffs and federal employees, and find a harmonious solution to our problem. The state governments are to protect the Union of States from encroachments of the federal government. The state governments are to protect. We call this interposition. Peaceful way to try and take a check and balance on a federal rule or regulation or law or Supreme Court decision. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Part 3, Life After Kleppe. Gouverneur Morris was a colorful character. He was the only founding father with a wooden leg. Everybody else clapped. Gouverneur Morris would stamp his wooden leg. He was the chairman of the Committee on Style. He was an important delegate. He was invited to write the Constitution. Now, after they spent 4.5 months debating, they have all sorts of copious notes taken and a great amount of discussion, and they're giving him now the responsibility to take that all and put it onto one piece of paper, collect it into a common document. That was his assignment. And he says in his own writing, I took the pen and I did it. So he wrote the Constitution. So when you have a trivia question sometime, who wrote the Constitution? By the way, what's the most popular answer to that? Thomas Jefferson. I get that all the time in high schools. Thomas Jefferson wrote it. Where was Thomas Jefferson when they wrote the Constitution? Where was he? France. Well, okay, he didn't write it. So we go through, nobody ever guesses Gouverneur Morris. They just don't get to that name. Anyway, he played a significant role. Here's what he did for us. He wrote a letter on December the 4th, 1803. Morris, oh, by the way, Morris was a nationalist. He was devoutly nationalist. He believed that the best system of government was to have 13 states and the rest of the country divided into provinces. And the 13 states would govern the rest of the territory as it developed into provinces. Now, does that sound like a good plan? All the government back in Washington, D.C. and along the eastern seaboard. That was his idea of good government. He wanted it so bad that he fudged a little bit, and he admitted it in a letter of December 4th, 1803. Morris, by his own admission, had attempted to concoct a deception, if not a fraud, hidden in duplicitous wording of the property clause. Oh my. Here's what he wrote, summary of it. This is the exact quote, but you'll have to Google it up to read the whole letter. I went as far as circumstances would permit. Had it been more pointedly expressed, a strong opposition would have been made. He tried to word the property clause so that it could be interpreted in a different manner. And here he admits that. In 1976, the property clause came up again. There were 6 words they wanted to evaluate. To understand that, we might look at the words of James Kent, a well-known and respected lawyer of 1826. He wrote, "Judges roam at large in the trackless field of their own imaginations." And now in 1976, we have the property clause, and the trackless field of their own imaginations is about to be applied. What does it mean, they said, to make all needful rules and regulations? Now the trackless field is sometimes called emanations from penumbrae. Now, I was amazed when I Googled up emanations from penumbrae. I thought I might find the word used or the definition, but instead it had me go to court cases where different judges actually said, we are looking into the emanations from penumbraes. Now, holy smokes! Is that how they decide what this means? They just make it up? The emanations from penumbraes, the best I can explain it, is like throwing the Constitution into a fire and watching the flickering flames and smoke. And then you say, aha, I see it now. I see it. Federal legislative power over public lands is complete and without limitation. We got that from the penumbraes. Here lies Gouverneur Morris, who with deception created the property clause. And I put a smile on his face because I think he'd be pleased to know how they later defined it. The jurisdiction clause family, supremacy. Supremacy clause. It reads, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land." Now usually we forget that middle portion. You have to make the laws in pursuance of the Constitution to make them supreme. If the United States Congress passes acts that are unconstitutional, they're not on the list of delegated powers, then they're not the supreme law of the land. The only way they can achieve that status is if they are operating within the limitation of powers that was granted to them. Now that's not too hard to understand. Kleppe versus New Mexico, summarizing. Congress may enact legislation governing federal lands pursuant to the property clause. And, quote, when Congress so acts, federal legislation necessarily overrides conflicting state laws under the supremacy clause. Are we supposed to believe that any federal legislation is then the supreme law of the land? Well, the truth is, no, it has to operate within the constitutional limitations before it achieves the status of supreme law of the land. This is a continuum of sliding judicial opinions. Now, there's plenty of room to add more. I just threw up a little scattering and this word sliding came from one of the justices that wrote it into his opinion. He said, we're sliding in our opinion. Continuum of sliding judicial opinions from Johnson versus McKintish in 1823 to Kleppe versus New Mexico, we have a complete reversal of opinions. Over here we were following the Anglo-Saxon concepts of freedom. Over here we're following the Roman civil law concepts of coercion. the Claus family was placed in this box. And here lies the Claus family, born March the 4th, 1789, died by strangulation in 1976. 126 days later, following Kleppe, the Congress passed FLPMA, the Federal Lands Policy Management Act. Emboldened and strengthened by the decisions of the Supreme Court, they determined that it is the policy of the United States that the public lands be retained in federal ownership. This is in complete, total violation of the original intent 200 years prior. Stop. Think. Wrong way. The consequences of Kleppe. Public lands within the states have been rendered jurisdictionally equivalent to pre-statehood territories, the District of Columbia and federal enclaves. The jurisdiction family has yet another clause. Claims. Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2. Nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any claims of any particular state. When a territory wants to become a state, and they write the proper documents and they prepare the proper, the things that are necessary, and then they become a state, they have legitimate claims. One of those claims is that the things that were promised to them be granted to them. And they were promised a long list of things that were not granted. This was not honored. All engagements, here's one of the promises that was not honored. All engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. This was not honored. By an act of Congress, the Constitution was amended by a change in policy to abandon the requirement to dispose of territorial and public land. Here the whole jurisdiction clause family is, they were abused. This is excellent reading. Statehood, the Territorial Imperative by Bill Howell and Bill Redd. Again, 524 pages of tedious reading, no pictures. These men did an outstanding job of collecting material. I gave this lecture in Texas a few years ago, and somebody tested me. 3 months later, I got a picture in the mail of this window. And they said, I didn't believe what you were saying, so I called my friend in England and said, check it out. I didn't know. I'd never seen the window before. And I got this picture in the mail, and he said, it's there all right. Okay, here's this window, the stained glass window in England. In 1910, the world's plan for happiness. I labeled it that. Up at the top they say, remold it nearer to the heart's desire. Now they're remolding the world. And they have the world, they heated it in this forge. This man is pumping on the bellows. Here's the bellows are. They heat the world, they put it on the anvil, and these men have their big black hammers, and they're remolding the world nearer to their heart's desire. What is their heart's desire? Well, these were the English socialists, and they had a long list of desires. They wanted a powerful central government that could control and direct the people, and the states could just be administrative agencies to carry out the whims of the central power. Now, down here we have men praying, and a slogan that says, pray devoutly, hammer stoutly. This man, he's thumbing his nose at it, by the way. His name is Edward Pease. H.G. Wells, get the right name. H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, Edward Pease, H.G. Wells. He's thumbing his nose at it. Now, when I was a kid in high school, that meant something bad. You weren't supposed to do that. Okay, he's thumbing his nose at what these guys are doing. These guys are worshiping at the altar, an altar of books. The top book is Plays 1, pleasant. The next book is Plays 2, unpleasant. The next book is Plays for Puritans. They're going to use the theater to teach their socialistic concepts of what makes people happy. Now, the bottom book is the one we want to look at. The bottom book is called Fabian Essays in Socialism. 35 years ago, when I first became interested in the topic of liberty, I don't know where I got it. I probably got it off the office shelf, in my office where my boss kept these books. I wonder what this is. I read it cover to cover. I took copious notes. Here are some of the notes that I put down. Now, these are the 12 principles I took out of the notes coming from that book that's on the bottom of the pile in 1910 in England. Government ownership or control of all land. Government ownership or control of major industries. Government control over labor. Each of these is worth an hour's presentation. I'm biting my tongue in between them here. Government control or ownership of communications and transportation. Government control of all credit. Government control of all insurance. Government control of the educational system. Elimination of the significance of family. Elimination of the significance of religion. Here they're removing the Ten Commandments from the Alabama courthouse property. But in Utah right now we're having our own problems. They want to eliminate the crosses along the highways that honor the people that have been killed there, the patrolmen. Eliminate the significance of religion. Establish a minimum wage. A universal system of pensions. This is FDR signing the Social Security Act. Justified use of force if necessary to attain these socialistic goals. This is a photograph of 38 law enforcement officers sent out to help confiscate the cattle from a ranch in Nevada. 38 armed men ready to kill if necessary to confiscate the rancher's cows. Justified use of force if necessary to attain the socialistic goal of government ownership or control of the land. Where did these come from? 1910. By the way, I haven't altered my notes. These are the way I wrote them 35 years ago as I read the book. Fabian Tracts and Essays. And a graduated income tax. This at that time, or this a few years ago, was the Director of Internal Revenue, and he wrote in the news release, "Tell us where you are and we'll send you money." Isn't that great? April 15th is about here. Tell him where you are and they'll send you money. Those, my friends, are the fundamental principles of socialism. Something our founding fathers would have completely been appalled at to see us embrace such doctrines into our country. What's on the window? Right here. This is their coat of arms. This, they said, is how we will accomplish this. Can you see what it is? It's a wolf in a sheepskin. They chose that symbol in England in 1910 to show how they would encroach upon the people around them. Silent, gradual encroachment. Now here's another sample of it. This is over during the European Union, as they formed the European Union. This is former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. Pardon my French, I don't know how to say it. So Mr. President, every day when they went in to discuss how to form the European Union, sat on the table this tortoise with a dragon's head as the symbol of how they would bring the European Union into being. This was called evolutionary socialism. Gradually, slowly, a little at a time, the central government will take over and control the lives and property of the people. Now, enter another problem. I mean, this untangling jurisdiction drove me mad. For 5 months, I'm going to be so relieved when I get done today. Enter sustainable development, a United Nations program, Earth Summit Agenda 21. President George Bush signed for the United States in 1992. A UN biodiversity treaty was brought before the Senate. They rejected it, soundly rejected it. Nevertheless, the President of the United States announced, we will implement Agenda 21 by administrative laws and executive orders. We don't need the Senate's approval. We'll just do it anyway. We'll just make it up. President Bill Clinton established the President's Council on Sustainable Development to carry out these United Nations admonitions. Congress has not acted quickly enough to protect federal lands. He made that well known. And so he took power under the Antiquities Act of 1906. And what did he do? And before we say what he did, where did Congress get the power to pass the Antiquities Act? Is that one of their constitutional delegations of authority to set up national monuments? Not unless you use the contemporary version coming from the modern Supreme Court. He added 19 new national monuments and improved the size of 3 more. In January, I'm just giving you a few little examples of what happened after the Sustainable Development Program of Agenda 21 came into being. In January, the Department of Interior Secretary announced that new mining near Grand Canyon would be banned on 1 million or so acres. Where did they get this authority? National monuments, prohibit national resource development, prohibit timber industry, reduce mining, inhibit oil production, regulate all these various parts of our country's natural resources, close the roads, establish wilderness areas, remove the dams, and on down the list of things that are coming under Agenda 21. I don't even know if the people that are implementing these have any idea where this comes from and the influence of the United Nations. It was the removal of dams that caused these people to meet in Wairika, California, October the 22nd, 2011. You've probably all heard the thing, read it. I watched it on YouTube. It's great. Great stuff. John Lopey's here today. He was conducting the meeting. There were 7 sheriffs and a property rights lawyer named Karen Bud Fallon. She explained to that audience that the federal government pays environmental groups to sue the federal government to stop the use of your property. She gave specific examples. $36 million was paid to 19 environmental groups in 9 years in 19 states. She says, I only have 1 employee, and we didn't do our homework completely. We just got you an example of what's going on. Sheriff Dean Wilson, I had spent a good part of my life enforcing the penal code, but not understanding my oath of office. Sheriff Greg Hagwood, a giant has been awakened, and the federal bureaucracy didn't count on that. Now, I hope a giant's been awakened, a peaceful giant, not an angry giant, just a peaceful giant. Let's learn our duty and act wisely therein. Sheriff Glenn Palmer's letter asking the forest supervisor, where does the U.S. Forest Service get its constitutional authority to have law enforcement officers within the county? They eventually sent him back an answer. One response that I have received in writing is that their authority is given through the cooperative policing agreement and that this agency has signed in the past. Upon asking for clarification and a second request, the response was that I needed to check with my district attorney. Neither response, in my opinion, is adequate. They eventually sent him on December 20th this 4-page letter, which was basically a photocopy out of the Forest Service Manual 5300. And I typed a few lines off the letter. Forest Service Law Enforcement Authority, 5301.1, laws. It then names 8 acts of Congress, and then 3 quotations from the United States Code, and this is where they get their law enforcement authority. But the sheriff didn't ask for law enforcement authority, he asked for constitutional authority. Shouldn't their constitutional authority be referenced to the Constitution? This is the best I've seen. This is a fine document and well written. It gives the best perspective I've ever touched and laid eyes on to explain contemporary understanding of constitutional authority of the Forest Service. It's well done. You ought to read it. Throughout the document, he mentions the property clause. The Supreme Court rejected the need for state consent. The Supreme Court rejected other things, and we have the Supremacy Clause to approve of what the acts of Congress do. On page 3, this bothered me a little bit because I felt it was incomplete. The federal enabling statute imposed several conditions for recognition of a state and admission into the Union, including the requirement that the state and its citizens forever disclaim any right or title to the federal lands within the state. Now that's all true, but there's more to the story than that. Why did the state write this into their enabling act? And there's a considerably further explanation to help understand this. On the concluding page, tens of thousands of criminal cases have been investigated and prosecuted and convictions obtained for violations of laws relating to the National Forest during this time. I presume that meant since the Forest Reserve Act of 1891. Well, that's the best explanation of the contemporary understanding of jurisdiction that I've seen. His question still stands. where does the United States Forest Service authority come from? If the property clause is correctly construed, then the paper from Attorney Power is accurate and well done. But what if the property clause over 100 years ago is misconstrued? There is no statute of limitations on violations of the Constitution. I'm going to let James Madison answer Sheriff Gilbertson's question. Since the general civilization of mankind, I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpation. Where does the United States Forest Service authority come from? Well, over the past 100 years, Mr. Pratt. Over 100 years ago, they started making these decisions. Yes, by gradual and silent encroachment. They have authority, there's no question about it. We must respect and work with it. But that's not the constitutional authority that was granted in 1789. The truth is, the United States Forest Service and BLM have no constitutional authority. By judicial misconstruction of the property clause, social do-gooders reinvented the structure of United States government. That's what the history and the facts bear out. These three men are running for governor in the state of Utah. Now, I don't know why they three got together, but they got together and they announced the three things they're going to run on. This is really interesting. Three candidates that like each other enough that they share these concepts. These are three things they share in common. These three candidates for Utah governor said they would actively fight to regain state control of federal land in Utah, refuse federal funding, and apply nullification. Now, if that isn't unique, I don't care which one wins, we'll be in the right direction anyway. What's this? Anybody recognize this contraption? Well, what do you think that is? Well, it's a torture rack, and this is a torture chamber. Now, I'm not implying that the United States has such a rack, but I'm going to hang the symbol of the federal government on the wall because they're operating, figuratively speaking, a torture chamber. Now, I'm sure they have more modern methods. I've heard waterboarding in foreign countries and things like that. This is an old-fashioned, I'm a school teacher, this is a symbol. It's totally symbolic. They're operating a torture rack. And on the wall beside the symbol of the United States, I'm going to borrow it out of the Hall of Congress. I'm going to borrow the fasces and I'm going to hang it beside it here. They didn't need two, they only have one now. And over on this side, I'm going to put the English coat of arms. This shows how we'll accomplish this. Like a wolf in a sheepskin, gradually, a little at a time. And down here on the front, I'm going to put the tortoise with the dragon's head overseeing the whole thing. You're going to watch what's going on like they did every day when they created the European Union. Now, on the torture rack, they have the United States and the United States Constitution, all stretched and distorted, and pulling it tighter and tighter, and it really hurts because it's no longer like it was in the beginning. The ratchet on the side is very important, a key element of a torture rack. Now, the legislature is pulling this lever, the executive branch is pulling this lever, and the Supreme Court is acting as the pawl. Now, the pawl keeps the ratchet from going backward, holds the pressure all the time. So each click now, we can get a little more pressure and change the system little at a time. This is called the ratchet effect. And the ratchet teeth are symbolic. They represent unconstitutional laws, unconstitutional regulations, executive orders, court decisions that are unconstitutional, each click taking us to a different side or a different direction. The Federal Register needs to be mentioned. These are pages of the Federal Register per year. That's 80,000 pages. That blue line means that during that year, George Bush, in his administration, added 80,000 pages to the Federal Register in a year. Remember the box? We're pouring in new pages all the time. The other administration is William Clinton, and it is interesting to me. Sometimes people tell me, well, the Republicans are conservative and the Democrats are liberal. I say, hey, that doesn't reflect on this chart. Looks to me like it's just the other way around. So they're pouring in pages and pages of new regulation into the Federal Register. And the average on this chart is 200 pages a day. new regulation being created by federal agencies who honestly have no constitutional authority for their existence according to the original intent of the Constitution. The 2009 edition of the Code of Federal Regulations contained 163,333 pages and 226 individual books. And as I was doing the research on this, I came across this picture. And underneath the caption says, "A few copies of the Code of Federal Regulations." It takes 5 times that many to represent 1 year. So I counted them up. James Madison, father of the Constitution, declared, "It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by the men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood." Example 1. Phil Barney, now deceased. I never met him, but he was a great and noble sheriff just over the mountain from where I live. Practiced or tried the concept of peaceful interposition. November the 7th, 2000. This was the headline in the local newspaper. "Ranchers and sheriff defy feds, take back seized herd of cattle." I've talked to my good friends in the BLM and others about this, and quite an interesting case. You've probably all heard about it. He interposed peacefully between the BLM and the ranchers. Had a peaceful ending. Sheriff Tony DeMeo did something similar. He interposed peacefully between the BLM and the family, the Hage family. In this case, the Hage family had suffered from encroachments and violations and harassment for over 20 years. Mrs. Hage died in 17 years into this thing. Then Wayne Hage died. And then 3 years later, the federal government ruled in favor of the Hage family and awarded them a few $1,000,000. One of the daughters was interviewed, and she said, "No amount of money can compensate for the hell we were put through." After all those years. What are we doing? This isn't supposed to happen. This is supposed to be America, where we have peace and prosperity and happiness. Something was wrong there. Anyway, a good sheriff interposed peacefully between them. Carrie Dam, a Nevada rancher, didn't have the same luck. Her cattle were confiscated, her horses and cows. And she said of this, "I always tell people I was free until 1973, before the BLM came." Now, I'm just giving you viewpoints. I've visited, interviewed. The Wildlands Project is designed to remove humans from rural lands and allow forest to grow out of control, even when forest fires threaten human life and property. Sheriff Benny House intervened peacefully and interposed between forest policy and his citizens in Otero County. This old rancher was an interesting interview. Bill Cox from Boulder, Utah. We had a long conversation, and Bill Cox said, "When I was a boy, the United States Forest Service was our best friend. Now the Forest Service and BLM are our worst enemies." Now, I couldn't find a rancher that had another viewpoint. Honest to goodness, I couldn't. Something's not working correctly here. We've got to solve these problems. Here's a gentleman I enjoyed meeting and visiting with. Sheriff Brad Rogers peacefully interposed between the Food and Drug Administration and an Amish farmer. These are constitutional sheriffs in 2012. There are many, many more sheriffs that take their oath seriously. They believe it means something. Bound by oath to uphold and defend this Constitution and the Constitution of the state that you live in, that you're working in. What does it mean to be bound by oath to support this Constitution? Now, this old judge, I respect him highly, enjoy him. He's probably still alive. He wrote this book in 1990. Judge Robert Bork, he was nominated by President Ronald Reagan to take a position on the Supreme Court. And as you know, you have to go through a Senate hearing. And when the Senate heard him say this, they immediately, enough of them, immediately opposed having him on the court. He said, "If I am placed on the Supreme Court, I will follow the original intent of the Constitution." And that was enough to cause all sorts of anger and upsetness, Senator Edward Kennedy led the charge to see that he did not make it to the Supreme Court. And his crime? He was going to follow the Constitution. Wow. He wrote in his book on page 174, this Constitution, and he emphasized the this, it's in italics, this Constitution, not one they make up themselves, is to bind the public. And so like Justice Clarence Thomas said, either they follow the original intent or they just make it up. It's this Constitution, it's the original intent we swear an oath to uphold, not the made-up version of some other court. In 2003, Judge Bork wrote this book, Slouching Toward Gomorrah, The Modern Liberalism and American Decline. And I'm reminded of the problems we face today, slouching toward Gomorrah today. We're on the verge of moral and economic bankruptcy in our country. And if we don't do something to turn it around and go back to fundamental principles, we will experience total moral and economic bankruptcy. He wrote in his book, and he was referring to the case of Lawrence versus Texas, where the Supreme Court overturned a law regarding sodomy. And he said at the end of his review of the case, the Constitution is simply gone. With other words, we don't follow it anymore. It's not a part of our governmental system. In 1911, the Supreme Court wrote, the constitutional equality of the states is essential to the harmonious operation of the scheme upon which the Republic was organized. When that equality disappears, we may remain a free people, but the Union will not be the Union of the Constitution. I submit for your consideration that we are not the Union of the Constitution today. We have abandoned those principles. Joe Sobran, the late Joe Sobran, where did the Constitution go? He writes a great essay. You can Google it up and read it. It's good. He says, the United States Constitution poses no serious threat to our form of government today. James Madison in Federalist 46 explained, the state governments are to protect the Union of States from encroachments of the federal government. The state governments are to protect the Union of States. We have a responsibility, a duty to perform. The sovereign states and subdivisions' duty to draw the line. We called this interposition. Peaceful way to try and take a check and balance on a federal rule or regulation or law or Supreme Court decision that is not in the constitutional interest of our country. The sheriffs can take an active role in that. I've given you a few examples of some of those brave and courageous men that did. That's the end of my lesson. But that's the beginning, I hope, of your, or hope encouragement to you to think, the beginning of your progress, your thinking about your role, your responsibility. We took the oath to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. We have a choice. We can do nothing. And if we do nothing, we're guilty of perjury, because we promised that we would do something to defend if encroachments arrive. Or we can continue as we are, supporting the encroachments, and be guilty of treason. Yes, treason, because in the Constitution it gives the definition of treason. If you do something against them and they, in the Constitution, those are the words referring to the states, and you're doing something against them and they and their rights and privileges and their claims, then you're guilty of treason. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? You could be guilty of treason by not doing anything. You can be guilty of treason by doing the wrong thing, or perjury. So what shall we do? I don't know. I can't tell you what to do. I just know that I have spent 5 months trying to understand jurisdiction. And I finally got my mind around it. And I hope that I can bubble out and share enough that you go home and say, hey, let's do something. Now, I know in this audience we have people with different viewpoints. I'm glad you're here. Hopefully you won't be offended by anything I said. I know you'll have a bushel basket of things you want to say, well, Mr. Pratt, didn't you consider, or whatever your viewpoints are. We all in this room have something in common. We're all Americans. We all pledged to uphold the Constitution, and the encroachments upon it happened before we were born. It's not your fault that you chose an occupation that supports some unconstitutional thing. You did it in good faith. I wanted to be a forest ranger when I was a kid because my best friend's dad was one. One of my other best friends became a forest ranger, had a wonderful life. He's still my good friend. These occupations are good and honorable, but how do we restore liberty in the land? How do we restore peace and sanity to good government? How do we work in harmony with each other? Search for these solutions. Liberty is a spiritual thing. James in the Bible refers to the Word of God, and then he calls it the perfect law of liberty. Paul in the Bible refers to the Spirit of God and says, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Work together. BLM, Forest Service, any government agency that's represented in here, sheriffs, work together. Instead of starting at this end and looking back at all the Supreme Court cases and acts of Congress that prove your point and try to preserve the status quo as it is, try going to the other end of American history. Let's say start on this side of the Atlantic Ocean with the settling of the Plymouth colony. And look at the principles that were used to found those colonies and how they eventually separated from the mother country, and they took those principles and they applied them to the Constitution. Start at that end, and you'll gain a new love for the country that you've never had before. Now, I want to give out books free, but I didn't bring a box full. Any federal employee in this room, whatever, BLM, Forest Service, attorneys, I'd like to give you a copy of The 5,000-Year Leap, the national bestseller in 2009. I wrote the foreword to it. It's a good book. The 28 Fundamental Principles of Liberty. Start at that end. And maybe we'll all come together, the sheriffs and federal employees, and find a harmonious solution to our problem. So if you'll give me your business card, let me know where you are. I will send you a free complimentary copy of the 5,000-Year Leap. I've got a big stack of them, so let me know who you are. That's for federal employees at any level that are here today. Thank you. My name is Stephen Pratt. Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.